Welcome to the mysterious Book Emporium. This week we continue on with more short stories set in Thetis from the novel Tevinter Nights. So why don't you take a seat as we go over the next 3 stories in the collection. Genitivi Dies in the End by Lukas Kristjanson, Herold Had the Plan by Ryan Cormier, and An Old Crow's Old Tricks by Arone Bray. Genitivi Dies in the End. It was 3 in the afternoon in Valrio when Philum met his sponsor, Lord Varendel, whose mask marked him as being new money in Orlais. The Lord is unhappy with Philum, as he had promised to deliver on works that were currently non-existent. But Philum isn't paying attention until Lord Varendel brings up an expedition beneath the Imperium, and he isn't asking Philum to go. He's telling him. Philum rolled the scroll out between them. His eyes widened. The document outlined an expedition that seemed fantastical. It included a strange assemblage of fragments, a collection of lore one might find in a conspiratorial basement. Philum pictured them as pins spread across a map with red strings noting connections between distant astrariums. And he could see the promise. To his eyes, the lines indirectly suggested a location, perhaps in the north of the Silent Plains. He had a gift for spotting the notable parts of greater grinding works. He made his living at it. That appeared to be why the offer was in his hands. Philum had heard the stories of why the Inquisition had ended, that the Dread Wolf had returned. He had heard rumors of spaces between the Crossroads and the Fade, broken places that weren't all there, which likely meant that the other pieces were in the real world, somewhere. In theory, someone could find these places and find what had undone the Dread Wolf and any other elf that called themselves gods. Philum laughs at his employer, who frankly tells him that he is owed money and he hasn't kept good on his word. This is both a chance to repay him and to do something good for the world. While Philum had known that Lord Varendel had invested in the Inquisition, he is surprised to find that the man actually believed in the cause. Lord Varendel also mentions that other scholars would be going on this expedition. It's then that a young woman's voice calls out behind Philum, which makes him cringe from the familiarity. Former Sister Ladine, an ex-member of the Chantry and current documenter of all things sensual and forbidden in Orlais, was invited as well. "You're looking well," said Ladine, her eyes sweeping past Philum to evaluate Lord Varendel's drakeskin tunic and his taste and spirits. She pursed her face slightly, as though his look was sour and his drink was loud. Philum knew that appraisal. Ladine's senses often swapped color, taste, and sound, a quirk of perception that gave her insights about character, something she had confided while evaluating his. They shared a past that meant they occasionally slept together, although they both agreed they wouldn't share a future. They fought as much as they intertwined, and it showed in their prose. They were peers in many ways, but she said he was green, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been found wanting. She tells the Lord that she had looked over the papers and had made some corrections on the map. Ladine had an affinity for Ancient Elven due to the language's strange structure and her abilities. Lord Varendel notes that he had also arranged for a guide, as well as another member. Philum is confused, and Ladine smirks. The group needed a member that had a breadth of knowledge for both the religious and geographical. A certain brother of the Chantry whose works Philum had condensed into smaller, more exciting novels. Brother Genitivi calls out to him then, calling him a thief on the eve of the longest month of their lives. Their journey into Tevinter was mostly uneventful. Their hired driver, Matteo, which Ladine notes was shirtless most of the time, was a famed Lord of Fortune. It was clear he had an appreciation for history, although he claimed not to know who the trio of riders were. The group had traveled off the Imperial Highway and were now stopped in front of a stone slab that Matteo recognized as an old dwarven shaft down to the deep roads. He pulls a lever and the 4 drop into the deep. The underground journey had gone fairly well. They crossed an old Tevinter mine, a dwarven crosscut, and even a tunnel that was clawed out by Darkspawn decades ago. Natural caves and the occasional support beam suddenly gave way to delicate elven carvings, the stone floor abruptly changing to mahogany hardwood. There was no doorway, no planning, or joinery. It was as if a pocket had suddenly formed in the rock, replaced by the notion that shelves and reading desks should simply be there. They had turned a corner and stepped into an elven library. When Arlethan fell, a piece of it had fallen here. Matteo stood guard while Philum and Ladine investigated the area, grabbing books that seemed promising. Genitivi, however, began to weep in the corner. He had spent his whole life traveling the world, searching for the Maker's grace, and here, in this ancient elven ruin, there was no room for the Maker. He had written lies. How much did he ignore? Philum is moved by the old man's emotions, telling him that he never intentionally lied. He honestly just didn't know. Besides, the world needs him now, and he's the only one of them that could piece this all together. Matteo hears something down the cave. It's the movement of the shaft that came down, and the Antam soon came after them. While they had tried their best to defend themselves, the group kneels in front of the elevator to the surface, spears digging into their necks. A woman who introduces herself as Rasan greets them, saying that she had been following the same threads but wouldn't have been able to find the remains of the library without them. But her interest was more specific than theirs. She wanted names. She goes to each member of the group asking their real names. While she sees that Matteo isn't the man's real name, it's clear that it's the only one he knows. Philum states his pen name, then his real name, which he is not used to saying. He has become what he has pretended to be, which the bard suddenly feels very hollow. Genitivi states his full name and lists of titles. She taunts him, asking to remove the titles, which he does, minus the title of brother. He is still a servant of the Maker. Rasan asks again, breaking his finger, but then he only calls out that he is a servant of the Maker. Before things get worse, Laudine quickly pipes up that she has a name no one has ever heard. Rasan is amused and leans in close to hear. Laudine whispered low in Rasan's ear. Philum saw the reaction, and it mirrored his. Cerebas alit an, said Laudine. She didn't know much of the language. Cunlot was coarser than ancient Elven, but she said enough. Sarabas literally meant dangerous thing, the Canary word for mage. Baslit an was a foe worthy of respect. Rasan's gray skin went white. She hadn't found the captives as mages. Laudine clenched a fence, and rift green energy erupted beneath her. Stone was rent from the floor as Rasan leapt back, but the guard behind Laudine wasn't as quick. A pillar of rock smashed him into the ceiling, crushing his chest. Matteo is able to grab the spear at his neck, freeing the others in the chaos. A fight breaks out, but seeing the only way of survival, Rasan reaches for the lever to the elevator, yelling for her and Tom to stay down, and sending the four up to the surface. Philum is able to grab a few elven books on their way out. On the surface, Matteo notes that there isn't a way to jam the elevator mechanism. Laudine really isn't able to do much with magic, as she had hid this ability all her life, and she just isn't trained. The lift then begins to descend again as Rasan calls the elevator down below. They run. Matteo is able to gather the four horses and attach them to the caravan they brought. Matteo drives the caravan while Laudine tries to recover from the small amount of magic she did. In the back, Genitivi holds his broken writing hand, yelling details for Philum to write down quickly. All the meanwhile, the Antam are gaining on horses of their own. Genitivi is confused, as this is not how the Canari usually conduct themselves. Plus, Rasan calling the Antam hers was very odd. Philum writes it all down best as he can. Arrows from the Canari rain down upon them, killing one of their horses, although Matteo is able to cut the loose weight. However, Philum looks up to see an arrow coming from Genitivi's chest, blood dripping from the end, which is odd. Genitivi shakes his head, and the bard noticed that a stain had started to appear in his own shirt. The arrow had gone through him. Laudine then screams, letting out all the magic she could and collapsing the Imperial Highway. While their caravan makes it out, many of Rasan's Antam fall into the new hole, the Canary woman just barely making it out alive. Matteo continues on the highway until it's clear that they are safe for now. Genitivi and Philum stare back, unblinking, so he closes their eyes. Laudine, on the other hand, hums a small tune, blood coming from her ears. She seemed relaxed, tranquil, alive, but gone. A week later, Matteo would deliver to Lord Verendel what Philum had written. A month later, it was given to another writer, Tethris, and plans were made. A year later, nations would stand and tremble. That's how you end it? Philum, a bard, brother Genitivi, and formerly sister Laudine, sat at a corner table in the Hilt, a roaming public house that was, according to this month's dice roll, on the coast of Ravane. Around them, Matteo's Lords of Fortune comrades slapped backs and tipped back. Pages were laid out between them, some ancient, some new, and under scrutiny. Genitivi leaned in his chair, tapping the side of his ale with a judgmental ring finger. Philum felt the scholar's critiques like Antam arrows. Philum goes on to explain that now with two of them dead and Laudine incapable of anything, they shouldn't be seen as a threat anymore. The three will continue their work, to write their warnings, but under different pen names. While Rasan will still chase them down, this does give them some time. Herold had the plan. Barv stumbled along in the forest near Starkhaven, certain that he would be hearing hounds and arrows whizzing past him at any moment. Falling into the Meander River, he takes a moment to listen. No guards or tournament nights. Perhaps he had a large enough lead? The dwarf climbed out of the river, having a hidden view of the rendezvous point. He had been a thief in his younger years, but it left him with a bad conscience. He had become a lord of fortune decades ago, and while it left him with many scars, he could sleep at night. Light elven footsteps were suddenly behind him, and Elim, another lord, noted that the job had been a disaster. She began to strip from her disguise, revealing more sensible traveling clothes. Barv offered her an apple, explaining that his 4 daughters had scolded him on eating right during these jobs. She stores the apple in her pocket, questioning it, as he had been running through the sewers not long before. They had been hired to steal an amulet from a lockbox at the Grand Tourney. Things had gone extremely smoothly, until suddenly everyone was after them. The entire city seemed to jump down their necks, and neither lord had any idea what happened to cause that. Elim asked about Herold, an old friend and business partner to Barv. He was the one who had been hired for the job and the one to make all the arrangements. The dwarf scout told Elim what she needed to know. He had been killed escaping the chaos. She asked him if they were together long. Lately I helped Herold chase Tevinter relics that were uncovered and sent rolling in the wake of this Santon chaos in the north. Plenty to chase. Damn horns kicked up all sorts of ancient dangerous things up there. Some were just waiting in rich men's vaults, begging us to recover them. Other artifacts were stolen from ruins and have been traded or sold since. You're holding one of those. Chased the prize through 3 owners in 2 weeks. Came out of a maze of catacombs the horns discovered. Herold and I had such times in those old places. There was always some ancient curse or resurrected beast to greet us. They continue to run using the river to match their trail as best as they could. Elim asks if he knows what the amulet does, but he isn't really sure. Afraid that it does something harmful, Elim, who had been carrying it, hands it over to Barv. Suddenly they hear thrashing up ahead, and the 2 spotted Panzot, a large warrior that they had hired to help them in their quest. The 2 wonder if they should approach him, as while neither trusts him, he might know what happened to cause the reaction at Starkhaven. The last Barv had seen him, he had been standing around some memorial to a chevalier who had won the last Grand Tourney, but had since died, or been murdered. The 2 begin to hear barking in the background, and they decide to keep wading through the river. Elim notes that there are good reasons to stay out of it, and when Barv begins to dismiss these claims, something grabs him. A Raytooth had grabbed the dwarf and was swinging him around, threatening to eat him. He thinks of his daughters and how they will have to survive the coming times without him, when suddenly Panstot kills the creature. The sound of hounds are getting closer, and the trio runs as far as they can, eventually hitting a waterfall. While the fall wasn't that far, it wouldn't be pleasant. An arrow whooshed by Elim's head, so Barv pushed Panstot and grabbed Elim as he jumped over the edge. Just when they think it's over, they fall over another waterfall. Finally, they are able to make it to shore, intact with enough distance between their pursuers. For now. As they walked, Elim didn't wait to push Panstot on what had happened back in Starkhaven. He told them that he didn't know, and he just saw running, so he did too. Elim and Barv share a look. Both know he isn't telling the whole truth. Elim then changes her tactics, asking what he will do with his share of the money. He begins to gush about he will find his older sister, who had gone off to become a Grey Warden, and he hadn't heard back from her. He had found a nice lady in Tanterville whose husband was a Grey Warden, and who could help him find his sister. If he gave her all the money, he would share from the job. Elim and Barv share a look again, but decide to drop it for now. Finally, Elim asks where they are headed. The dwarf had been dreading this conversation, and finally decided to let everyone know. Herold had been the one with the plan. He didn't know where to turn the amulet into to get the reward. Elim pulls out a knife and the 2 argue. Panstot softly asks them not to, but they continue. He finally gets in between them, saying that Herold had told them that the amulet would be given to some sort of squire. Elim scoffs as no squire could afford this, but Barv suddenly remembers something Herold had said once about a squire. Elim changes the subject then, asking the large man to go see what lies ahead. When he is out of earshot, she questions about Panstot's story. While she didn't care that he was likely being scammed, she was curious about how when they came to the tourney, he had a hammer, and now he carried a sword. The trio continued on. Chasing relics across Tevinter, he and Herold had witnessed firsthand the children and families wounded by the northern battles. He passed several makeshift hospitals with thin walls that bulged with fresh patients. Real wartime shit. It was difficult to walk away from. For 2 days after, Barv nearly had to drag Herold south. He kept looking back, and Barv didn't need to ask what misery was on his mind. Barv notices that his hand feels a bit different and pulls it out of his pocket where he had been fidgeting with the amulet. The scratches he had received earlier were gone, so it seems this was a healing amulet then. While he would have told Herold about this, he decided to keep it from the others. Suddenly, Elim calls out for them to stop. From the forest, a Ferelden voice calls out that while they only want the sword, they will kill them all the same, although it's obvious that they don't know where the trio is. Elim pressures Panstot, and he says that he was told to steal it from Lady Lucy, the woman who will help him find his sister. It's then that they notice his sword is covered in carvings and names. The voice's other hunters pass by, and when enough time has passed, the elf pressures Panstot to see the sword better. He refuses, and an arrow lands in the tree next to them. The two Lords of Fortune run, furious at Panstot, who runs the other way. Eventually, the two approach a knight who had been crushed by his horse after being attacked by Panstot. He was dying. They question him on what the sword is, and he answers that it's Celebrate, before dying. Barv is confused, but Elim curses. She explains that the sword must be Celebrant, the famous sword of the Grand Tourney that is passed down to each winner, etched with all their names. Panstot must have grabbed it from the memorial to the last winner. The two take a moment wondering if they should run, but come to the conclusion that Starkhaven won't rest until it's found. As neither of them wish to be famous, they need to get that sword back to them. Somehow. Elim deduces that the lady he met should be in a village nearby to pick up the sword, so their meeting place shouldn't be far, and thankfully it isn't hard to track the warrior. They find him in a clearing with a woman dressed in black mourning dress. Elim and Barv confront them both, saying that they have no wishes to be hunted for their crimes. The woman calls out that the sword is hers, and it's only right she has it back. Barv pieces it together then that this is the widow of the murdered chevalier who had won the tournament last time. It's then that the Starkhaven Knights finally catch up with them, also recognizing the woman. Panstot interrupts that Elim and Barv stole something too, but the guards look confused. The dwarf is secretly proud that their theft had gone unnoticed. When pressured to know what they stole, Elim cries out that it is a very valuable red amulet, but now she no longer wants it, and with that she tosses up the apple that Barv had given her, and the two Lords of Fortune begin to fight their way out of the ambush. However, Barv is slashed across the chest, leaving him so that he cannot walk. Out of desperation, he clings to the amulet in his pocket. Elim attacks Panstot, but he grabs her by the throat, sawing deep into her side with his sword. With one final move, Elim takes her hairpin and strikes it deep into the warrior's chin, through his mouth and into his skull, instantly killing him. The guards, picking themselves up after the Lord's attack, are a bit shocked at what happened. They bind the widow's hands to take her back, take the sword, and leave Barv and Elim for dead. Barv crawls over to the elf who is bleeding out. She tells him that that was the worst job she ever took, and she at least wanted to know what the amulet did. Barv opens his mouth, but thinks about his daughters, so he says nothing, and the world goes black. Sometime in the night, Barv awakens, his wounds closed. He was alive. He quickly takes the amulet and presses it against Elim, trying to save her, but she is too cold. He ends up staying the rest of the night there, hoping that something in the amulet would work, but nothing does. He wonders how long Herold had known that they were chasing a healing amulet. Sometime later, Barv circles a bar that he and Herold had been before. There was always a pattern to the places Herold picked for the pickup, and this place seemed to fit. Inside, he notes an older knight telling stories of places he had been, and Barv buys 2 drinks at the bar. He heads over to a table with a single elven woman who he believed to be the squire. "This is not a good time," the young elf wrinkled her nose at his stink. "I'm expecting someone." Barv enjoyed finally sitting down too much to answer right away. The elf glared at him. "I'm trying to be polite. I'm not interested in you or your drink." "Good, because neither's on offer. These are both mine. You know, Herold said you were kind." He raised his first glass and drank an astonishing amount in one mouthful. Her surprise showed. "Barv? Bea, nice to meet you." She asked him if he knows the arrangement that she had set up with Herold, and knowing his friend, Barv had figured it out. Herold had taken the job, but turned it into a charity run, asking Bea to bring the amulet to Tevinter to help the makeshift hospitals. There was never any money to be made. He hands the amulet over to Bea, telling her how to use it. She questions if it actually works, and he notes that it does, but only on a living. The two then toast Herold and the Lords of Fortune. In Old Crow's Old Tricks. Chancel, a soldier for a Centauri troop in the Tevinter Imperium, stood guard for the new encampment. She enjoyed this time of day and the sun setting over the Notion Sea. Down the road, she notices a small old woman hunched over from a large pack heading her way. This woman had been traveling to her frequently to sell her goods, which Chancel had been reselling in camp to make a small profit. The two greet each other fondly, and the old woman's smile reminds Chancel of her own friendly grandmother. The woman tells her that she has something special for her and pulls out a long, silky, hollow wool scarf. Chancel takes it from her and sniffs it. While it really only smells of baked goods from the old woman's pack, she makes a face and claims that it still smells of the dirty challah. How dare this woman want her to wear something elven? The merchant apologizes, but begs to show her how nice it is for keeping her hair nice in her helmet. It's clear that she wants to make this sale. She allows the old woman to demonstrate how to wear the scarf properly, having to bend down a bit so that she can reach. The old woman starts to hum a tune that seems familiar to her, but she can't quite place it, so she asks what it is. Suddenly, the old woman tightens the scarf around her neck and kicks the back of her legs. She goes on to tell Chancel that it's an old Dalish tune, one that used to be sung by children in a camp not far from here. Chancel remembers then how when they set up camp here, their leader, Magister Biclius, ordered the whole group to be wiped out so they wouldn't compete for resources. Chancel had to catch some children who had escaped. His mother called him Syl. He was 12. You held him under the water. Chancel still struggled, but the older woman's grip was too strong. Did he fight back? While his breath left him and you held his shoulders to keep him still, did he thrash? Kick? Try to scratch or bite? The soldier's arms started to go limp. Did you know that the Oranavara clan also sold their goods? They even made enough money to purchase a contract from the Antivan Crows. Chancel was almost beyond the point of hearing, but the older woman obviously knew what she was doing. Lesif of the Antivan Crows has fulfilled the contract. Lesif ties the woman's body to her spear, making it look like she was just quietly watching over the sea. Pentiri, an older member of the Centauri, called out to his subordinate, Salatin. It was their job to set up tents for the incoming soldiers tomorrow morning. It was dark out, and Salatin begs his commanding officer to build a fire, which he begrudgingly agrees. The boy was too much of a child for this life, Pentiri thinks. While sitting around the fire wishing he was surrounded by more competent soldiers, young Salatin slyly tells him that he has been injured by a splinter. Pentiri explodes on the young boy, telling him how ridiculous he is being. He needs to turn away from the boy to control his anger for a moment. The young lad slumps into a log, apologizing, but the older man continues to say that he has had enough. Tomorrow he will walk to their leader, Magister Biclius, and highly recommend that Salatin be stripped of his rank. He waits for a response from Salatin, but the boy stays silent. He demands one out of him, but there is silence still. He grips the boy's shoulders, but his body limply falls to the ground, a long, thin line of blood coming from his neck. He was dead. Out from the darkness, he hears a voice saying that Lesif of the Antivan Crows has fulfilled the contract. Pentiri is chilled and tries to find the source of the voice, but can't see anything. Sword in hand, he tries to defend himself, but something hits his leg, making him drop his weapon and now unable to stand. The same voice calls out, asking if he remembers a Dalish couple that both he and Salatin had killed. Do you remember? The voice was higher, almost sounding pleased, and the unmistakable sound of a giggle hung in the air. Yes, I remember, he almost screamed. Then she started to run, and I had Salatin shoot her. He missed and the arrow struck her leg. Magister Biclius ordered me to go after her. He ordered me. You chased her through the woods taunting her. You knew she wouldn't be able to get away. Did he order you to do that? He had just enough time to see Lesif kill the fire, plunging them both in darkness. He attempts to crawl away, but in his panic he becomes tangled in the tents and ropes, unable to move. When his eyes finally adjust to the darkness, he can see that he hasn't really gone far from where he started, and Lesif sinks his own sword into his chest, pinning him to the ground. For 17 years, Magister Biclius felt more at home in battle camps than his home of Ventus. While most of his forces were still on the way, what woke him suddenly was how quiet it was in camp. A small whiff of fresh air blew across his face, letting him know that someone had entered. He stepped to the other side of his tent and lit a lamp that hung above, revealing a small, older woman who had frozen in place. Biclius was a small man, not much taller than 5 foot, and he had honed his body to the best physique possible. While other mages had only focused on strengthening the mind, he also focused on his strength. The woman was smaller than he was, and looked so frail compared to him. She looked a bit unkempt, wearing colorful rags, but there was something in the way she held her dagger that let him know she had training. A crow. He poured them both some wine, but she never moved from her spot. He tells her that as a magister, this isn't his first time with a crow, and he has killed more impressive assassins before. He also goes on to brag about his strength, about one time a young soldier displeased him, so he beat him to death. He goes on to ask which Tevinter noble sent her this time, and Lesif points to a chest in the tent. The chest is something that Biclius has had for ages. It was carved in his various accomplishments over his career, and she had pointed to a panel that showed him standing in front of a burning Aravel. Or at least it did. Now it showed him burning along with it. He is outraged that this woman would ruin his things, and she asks if he remembers. "Do you recall, dear, the warmth of the fire as you burned the leader of the Aravel? Her howls of pain as you burned her alive in her own home? Or do you only remember taking this?" She shifted her robe slightly, coming to her full height and extending her hand. Biclius hadn't seen her stow her dagger or where the object came from, but he did recognize the Hala statue. "This iron-bar Kala is the symbol of Gilinan. The Oranvara didn't even remember how they came to own it, but they believed she would protect them, as long as they kept this Hala safe. She would watch over them, guide them to new fertile lands to grow food, new areas to hunt, and beautiful lands to raise their children. They trusted her, and you stole her. You stole everything from them." She paused, holding his gaze. "My name is Lesif, and I have fulfilled this contract." Biclius roars and leapt across the tent, but Lesif is able to dodge out of the way. However, something is wrong. His movements are slowed. Lesif gently tells him that it was the oil in the lamp. Many in Ativa enjoy the feeling of a certain herb, but many who use it for the first time are greatly affected, becoming lethargic and sleepy. With the last bit of his strength, he takes a nearby sword and swings wildly at Lesif, but misses and hits the supporting beam of his tent, sending it crashing down, along with the oil and lamp. He is trapped, unable to call on his magic or his strength as the tent catches fire. Tainsley, an elderly human man, stretches out on his small boat. Despite his age, he still towered over most, reaching about 7 foot. He had been having a lovely day, dreaming about sitting at home in front of the hearth when he had seen Mistress Lesif running down the hill being chased by 2 Tevinter soldiers. He grumbles that this woman will be the death of him as he gears up for what she told him to wear: large, heavy armor and a helmet with horns. Lesif calls out to him in Cumlot, which he does not speak. He gets out of the boat, staring, and she continues to call out orders he doesn't understand, assuming he should be holding the battle axe he was given and taking a battle stance. Without slowing, Lesif reaches Tainsley and uses his thigh to jump into a standing position on his shoulders. She calls out in Cumlot again, and he sunk deeper into a battle stance. However, he didn't need to bother. The soldiers that were chasing her had grown too fearful of the large, armored figure and ran off. When they were out of sight, Lesif giggles and gently removes the man's helmet, kissing his forehead. She asks if everything is ready, and it is. With everything that had happened that night, those who investigate what had happened will believe that it was part of a Canary attack, and that the Crows and the remainder of the Dalish clan had nothing to do with it. "Tainsley, do you think you could—" Her words trailed off, and he heard the unmistakable sound of her snore. "Yes, Mistress Lesif," Tainsley acknowledged, and made his way back to the boat. He began to hum as she rested. It was a song he had been taught back when his family would visit his cousins, and they would be sent out to gather water from the stream. Thanks to his mistress, his uncle's clan would at least have their Hala statue back. Discussion. First, we need to thank the artists of the week. First, we have this piece of Vea from Tina Fire Angel, who you can check out over on Twitter. Then we have this cute drawing of Lesif and Tainsley from Angel, who you can find over on Tumblr and DeviantArt. I also want to apologize I'm being so late with this, but things are just busy preparing for baby who is due in less than a month as of at least recording this. I have pushed back the submission date for the last 3 chapters of the novel, which will be announced at the end of the video. Now, I also want to add that there is a chance baby comes before I can finish the next video. The next section is already a lot longer than any of the others, plus there are a lot of pins I need to get to, and there is so much to talk about in the next 3 stories. So not only will this likely be probably the longest Book Emporium video to date, there is a chance that it could come out sometime in August or September, depending on when baby just pops out. I'll try my best, but things happen. Okay, before I really begin with talking about the details of Genitivi dies in the end, we need to talk about the structure, because I absolutely massacred it. The whole structure of the story is that Philem is writing about what has happened, with breaks in between time jumps where the trio actually critique his work. Because of this, it takes away from some of the stress of the title and even the opening paragraph where everyone dies, because nowhere else would this critique make sense other than the end of the story, letting you enjoy the journey as you go along rather than wondering what will happen to your favorite codex writers. At the same time, these parts don't actually include the names of the writers, so there is that little bit of fear that maybe this is somebody else, but in the context of the story, it just really doesn't make sense. So it's a lot more lighthearted than you get from my rendition. I think I also need to give some context to who all 3 of these people are, given I know some of you don't touch the codexes at all. While the story does give all the details you need to understand who they are, I just want to add a little bit more. Brother Genitivi should be the most familiar to those of you who played the series, as he comes up quite a lot and even was a major character in the quest for the Sacred Ashes in Origins. He's the writer for most of the codexes that are about basic things in Thedas, like the different nations, myth, or factions. In lore, he's the most read author in Thedas until Varric's Heart and Hightown series is published. Now, as a side note, he can die in the Temple of Sacred Ashes. I have no explanation on how he is alive, and it sounds like he is alive no matter your world state, given that he is the Randy Dowager and her works were published after Origins. The only explanation I can give is that perhaps he is like a dead Liliana, where he's some sort of lyrium being that was taken the place of Genitivi. I don't know. Philum, a bard, first appeared in Dragon Age 2 attached to mostly codex entries where he either collected or translated works that he published with his name. His rivalry with Genitivi was actually explored a bit in World of Thedas, along with a connection that he was related to the Human Inquisitor. Most of his work is overly dramatic, which again is brought up many times in the story. Formerly, Sister Lydene is the newest of the bunch, appearing in Inquisition. This story states that she specializes in tales of the forbidden in Orlais. Well, in-game, pretty much all of her work is found in Val Rayo, and the scandal isn't as much as I think the story implies. If anything, I'm pretty surprised to know that she knows any bit of Elven at all, as there was no hint of that in what we know of her. However, I actually really like these additions to her. Her strange abilities, which is sort of a real-life condition called synesthesia, are an interesting quirk, and I'd love to see how that could relate to being a mage or not. What the story doesn't really say it outright, what the trio are looking for are the other pieces of the Shattered Library from Trespasser. And at the very least, they end up finding one part of it. What I do find odd is that these pieces are located well beneath the deep roads and not closer to the surface. The story doesn't give a good explanation for that, and I can't really either, although I do wonder if it has something to do with lyrium. In our early understanding of lyrium from Origins, lyrium was said to bridge the gap between the waking world and the Fade, as it would grow in both places. Perhaps the ancient elves used this bridge to anchor their buildings into the real world, and when the veil was brought up, the parts attached to lyrium would stay behind? Granted, this is all theory, but that made the most sense to me. So, despite the writers talking about how much they learned from the journey, we as the reader don't actually learn anything new, minus like maybe one minor detail that many fans already assumed to be true. There are a few parts where the story talks about what they learned and its importance, but really, if you talked with Solus at the end of Trespasser, he tells you everything already. If anything, this group put at least a month of hard work just confirming what Solus says. If they did learn anything new, it's been held back from the story, and if anything, if you haven't played Trespasser, the story might be a good in-between for that and the next game. This might even be the setup for codex entries in the future, explaining how the writers know what they know, other than the Inquisitor just having to sit down and explain everything for everyone. From Joy, the Fen'Harel question. If neither Fen'Harel, Dreadwolf, or Solus, Pride, is his true name, who is he originally? I wonder when he took the name Solus. After a failing, perhaps when Mythal was killed? So this is a great question, but I want to say it isn't when Mythal was killed, but it's not like we have a clear timeline of when that happened. See, when Solus talks about being Fen'Harel, he says that he was Solus first, in that between the two, he was called Solus before he was called Fen'Harel. When Mythal was killed, it does sound like Fen'Harel was already around, although I'm assuming a lot between the lines here, so it could be changed, but I want to say that it was something else we don't know about. So, Qunari names are confusing, and that Rasan could be someone who we have seen before, or it could not. Rasan was first seen in the comics Those Who Speak, and also has a similar fascination with true names, although that might just come with the job. While she might be a different Rasan, the one from the comics is still alive, so I do think it's likely it's the same person. Her exact role is interesting in that she started out as a Tamasaran but was chosen as the successor of the Arakune, which is the head of the religious branch of the Qun. But, while she is waiting for that position to open up, she travels around with the Arashok, head of the military branch of the Qun, and advises him on what the will of the Qun currently is. The fact that, in this story, she is not nearby the Arashok doing her own adventuring and seems to have her own Antam is fairly unusual. Also adding in what we know of the Three Trees to Midnight, the Qun is in disarray. The military and the religious branches seem to be fighting amongst each other over what the best course of action is. I think there's some disorganization for sure, though. If this is the same Rasan, she's been traveling with the military branch for some time, and as an advisor to the Arishok, would have been one of the first of the religious branch to know something was wrong. So, is she on the side of the Arishok, or is she loyal to the Arakune? And could it be that her and Tom are those that rebelled against the Arishok and wish to stay loyal to the Arakune, or in this case, the next best thing, which is Rasan? So I cut out a lot of the ending because in the end, it's Philem's fiction. In reality, the real story ends with them coming to the surface after Rasan sends them up, and Mateo just jams the controls so they have time to run. Everything after that is just fantasy. What is interesting about the story is that it seems that we will be hearing from Brother Genitivi, Philem a bard, and formerly Sister Lydene again, but it will be under different pen names. Because the three of them do have different writing styles and that are fairly unique, I think this could be a fun minigame in Dragon Age 4 Codex entries, where you try to find out what new Codex writers are actually really old friends in disguise. Okay, I've been waiting to talk about the Lords of Fortune until now because this story probably has the most about them, and this is the last story in the collection with a member in it. From what we can gather from this novel, the Lords of Fortune is a guild that is either based or originated from Ravain. Although it doesn't seem like members need to be from that area, many are, or at least live there, like Barv. They seem like a guild that doesn't so much focus on stealing, but rather treasure hunting that often resorts to stealing. In various stories, we have seen them working on their own or in groups, working towards their own fortune, the fortune of their families, or hired on for larger organizations. There does seem to be a common outfit of wearing colorful clothing and trinkets from their adventures, although it's not mandatory as Barv doesn't wear it, and seems to be reserved for those that at least last a few years in the order. From the few we have encountered, it's obviously a dangerous job, but there's some like Barv that have been doing it for decades. There also seems to be some sort of honor among these who are lords, which, as a side note, even female members call themselves lords. Barv mentions a sense of purpose he has with the guild compared to when he was working as a thief. Two of the ones we meet in the novel have specialties in costumes and accents, but Barv and Herold both seem like they didn't do much of that. So really this would vary from person to person. And finally, there does seem to be some set of rules or code. It doesn't seem to be a hard set of rules, but rather guidelines to get the best possible outcomes on a job. Like, never tell your plans to people, which is mentioned in Herold Had the Plan. Overall, we have very little on the guild, and what a member looks like varies wildly even in this novel. But I would like to wager that this seems like a perfect guild that our future player characters might be a part of. The possibilities are endless when it comes to backgrounds, and we have seen that they take anyone who is willing to work and has the skill. I cut this out of the story for the most part, but Alim is a master of accents, and even Barv doesn't know which one is her real one. Someone of this description is actually mentioned to have trained the lord known as Holix, so we are to assume that Alim is the one who had taught them. This might also speak to how small the Lords of Fortune Order really is, as they all seem to know each other a little bit. Now, sadly, she does die in the chapter, so we won't be able to hear her abilities in-game. We get a new monster that is this river thing called a Raytooth, which seems to be a mix of a snake and a stingray of sorts. Really nothing much to add other than I don't want to meet it. It's a perfectly fine monster, I just no thanks, I'll pass. At one point, Barv is telling a story about Herold where he gets drunk and tells this elaborate lie about something cool he would have done, and at certain points in the story accidentally calls the protagonist, which should have been himself, the Admiral. While there are no certain clues in the story other than it being set at sea, Isabella currently goes by the title Admiral Isabella other than Captain. So while not confirmed, this could be a story about her. The sword mentioned in this story is actually a sword you can get in-game, although it doesn't seem as cool as it is in the story. It can be looted off a demon in Dragon Age 2 and is a pretty decent greatsword. I also want to mention that I have no idea why the Chevalier was murdered, or if he wasn't, why his wife believes so. His name isn't mentioned anywhere else in the series, and the story doesn't really talk about it all too much. I'm not sure if this is just some minor detail that doesn't really matter in the end, or something that might be wrapped up later, as like maybe the Grand Tourney's a bunch of cheats, I don't know. But I guess just something to keep in mind if you hear a very angry window and a dead champion. In constantly being that guy to the series, I do have to point out one confusing line from the story. She was a tall woman, only a haircut shorter than a limb, with a dress Barv thought cost more than his house. Elim is an elven woman, who are normally shorter than humans. If Lady Lucy was tall, she wouldn't have been shorter than Elim, and if Elim is just a tall elven woman, her height probably should have been brought up earlier. Maybe it was in an early draft, or maybe I just missed it, but either way, it does seem like an odd phrase in context with the rest of the world. So in the surprise ending, the squire that was talked about is actually Vea from the ongoing Dragon Age comics. Sir Aaron too is also mentioned, but only in passing. This honestly helps date this story, as it sounds like it's sometime, obviously after Knight Errant, when Vea joins the Inquisition, and likely even Deception, but probably before Blue Wraith. From Joy, the red amulet. So many questions. Is it just red, or is it the first healing red lyrium we've seen? Just a MacGuffin, or will this be seen again? Why was it at the Grand Tourney? Or rather, who is the buyer and how upset are they to lose this magic item? Honestly, I'm leaning towards this just being a MacGuffin, and I don't think it would be a red lyrium, or they would have said something about it, because that would be huge. However, I do also want to know who originally wanted Herold and Barv to get the amulet, and how pissed they are to not have it. I skipped this in the summary for the most part, but they were originally hired by someone else to get the amulet, and they traveled it around for 3 different places, and then Herold just got a big bleeding heart and then decided to give it away for free. So I don't know if they were paid up front or paid after, but someone wanted this and now they don't have it. This is a really silly little bit, and it might change depending on the version you have, but in my version of the novel, height comes up at least twice in Old Crow's Old Tricks and seems to be important, but it's also listed in feet. While I'm the American that is used to this measuring system, I just wanted to post the conversion unit so that everyone has some context to how short the Magister was and how tall Tainsley was. While an exact location wasn't given to where this Tevinter camp was, we can narrow down where it roughly was from the beginning of the chapter. The guard woman who is on patrol mentions seeing the Notion Sea and the mountains, which would place her on the eastern side of the sea. This ends up making a lot of sense, as this is where the Qunari have been taking over Tevinter cities. There is one line that talks about the Tevinter army squashing groups of apostates, and I'm confused. From my knowledge, apostates are a uniquely non-Tevinter idea, being a mage who is not part of the Chantry Circle and therefore dangerous. Tevinter holds the idea that mages don't need to be part of the circle, so there wouldn't really be any apostates. While it's possible that there is a different meaning in Tevinter for the word, at the moment, I don't really know it. From Joy, the Notion Sea is bordered by Tevinter on 3 sides, if I'm looking at the map correctly. Why was this clan so near or inside of Tevinter borders to begin with? I suppose if they were traveling to the Arlathan Forest, that is near Antiva? Honestly, I had the same question. Granted, the camp was likely somewhere close to the Arlathan Forest, but not near enough to make the presence make sense in Tevinter. A Dalish Inquisitor mentions to Dorian that their clans tend to stay out of Tevinter for good reasons, so I'm not sure why this clan thought it would be a good idea. As much as I hate to admit it, their keeper made a bad call for camping there, and this story seems to be the result. Plus, let's assume that Tainsley has been with Lessa for a while, which means that he likely lives in Antiva. He also mentions visiting his family and the clan quite often. Unless his clan up and moved to the Anderfells for some reason, which is described as a desert for the most part, I'm not sure why they would need to travel through that part of Tevinter at all. So, a statue of Gillenon was stolen from the Dalish clan that they believe would keep them safe. From the statue's description, it kind of sounds like those hollow statues that you would find in the Winter Palace, but I'm not exactly sure. Some people have pointed out that the usage of Gillenon is an interesting one given the horror of Hormak earlier in the novel. However, other than being the same goddess, I can't really call in any parallels as to it being important. The only thing I could say is that this is a coincidence that the 2 writers chose the same goddess, or because technically Gillenon is not said by name in Horror of Hormak, perhaps a small nod to remind you of who Gillenon is. Lessif talks about a nameless drug that, when smoked, makes one feel sleepy and even seems to make it hard to concentrate, particularly those who take it for the first time. Lessif mostly is unaffected, although in the end she does fall asleep, which could just be an old woman who stayed up all night murdering a handful of people, or maybe she was affected, it's kind of debatable. But either way, she was a lot more resistant to it than Magister Biclius, so hey, Lessif likes to party, doesn't she? Now, as fans, we don't actually have that much Cunlot that is translated for us, but even Lessif doesn't know what she is saying to Tainsley. When asked, she believes that it's something about burning cookies, and we all have a good laugh, but in me being pedantic, here's my best attempt at a translation. Sten, Shak Basra, Vashiden Tam, Tetha, Noms Darvat. Very, very loosely, and based on the wiki, soldier, war, Basra is a root term for a non-Canary, shit axe, look, cake, I don't know what dar means, and then fire. So yeah, you can kind of see the burning cookies bit here. And Nira Antam we know means for the Antam. So then, where do these stories fall in with the others in terms of most new lore to least? Honestly, while a lot of these stories are really fun, there really isn't a lot of new lore to them. Genitivi Dies in the End is actually probably one of my favorites in this novel, and I can't describe how much I loved reading about various Codex writers going on adventures and not really getting along. However, other than confirmation that Solus's name isn't Solus, which many assume to be true, Rassam being back and the Canary acting weird, and that various Codex writers might have new names of Dragon Age 4, there isn't that much to say. It's likely that much of this will be restated in some form in the games anyway, so I'm actually going to rate this above Murder by Death Mages, which is about midway in the list now. Herold Had the Plan was probably the best introduction to the Lords of Fortune that we have in the novel, but even then not much is said about it. Like many of the other stories on this list, it all depends on how much the Lords of Fortune become important later on in the series. Assuming they are, I would rate this above Callback, but I feel like I'm being a bit generous here as there really isn't that much on them overall. Finally, Old Crow's Old Tricks really only adds in some minor information on the structure of a Tevinter unit of soldiers. While reading about an old woman kick ass is actually really fun, I'm gonna have to put this pretty low on the list, just above Hunger, because at least something new was said about Tevinter. And with that, thank you to everyone who submitted entries, and I look forward to what everyone comes up with next. If you have any comments, artwork, or anything else, please send it in. Our final section consists of the stories 8 Little Talons, Half Up Front, and The Dread Wolf Take You of Tevinter Nights. So please send me your things by June 7th, 2020. Either send me an email at gildathon@gmail.com or a tweet at gildathon on Twitter. To rest your all.